Adrian Moss had always possessed an extraordinary talent for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, which made it cosmically ironic that he now found himself hurtling through the Kepler Strait toward Etherian aboard humanity's most important diplomatic vessel. The Meridian's Hope was a masterpiece of engineering, all sleek curves and quantum drives, designed to make a statement about Earth's technological prowess. Adrian, meanwhile, was designed to sit in quiet rooms deciphering dead languages from civilizations that had the good sense to keep their communications at a safe distance, preferably separated by several thousand light-years and a few million years of extinction. "You're actually going to meet them," said Commander Helena Voss, appearing beside him in the observation deck with the quiet authority of someone who had never accidentally started an interdepartmental incident by mistranslating a budget memo. "The Etheri. In person." Adrian pressed his palm against the viewport, watching Etherian grow larger in the distance. The planet seemed to pulse with lavender light, wreathed in atmospheric phenomena that Earth's scientists had been arguing about for the better part of a decade. 3 silver moons hung in a perfect triangle above the night side, and Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him specifically. "I'm actually going to make a terrible impression on them," Adrian corrected. "There's a difference. A subtle one, but important to my therapist." Helena didn't smile. She had been chosen for this mission because of her unflappable nature, her ability to navigate complex political situations with grace. Adrian had been chosen because of a filing error in the colonial administration's personnel database that had somehow conflated xenolinguistics with xenodiplomatic relations, and because he'd been too absorbed in translating a particularly fascinating dead merchant's shopping list to notice the 14 increasingly frantic messages asking if he was prepared to serve as Earth's linguistic liaison. "You've studied the briefing materials?" Helena asked, which was her polite way of asking if he'd read anything at all. "Extensively," Adrian lied, which was his polite way of saying he'd skimmed the first page before becoming distracted by the etymology of the word Etheri and spending 6 hours constructing a wholly theoretical linguistic framework that he was reasonably certain was completely wrong. "They're humanoid. They value something called Threnai, which is either a sophisticated philosophical concept about interconnected destinies or a really elaborate way of saying they like holding hands." The briefing wasn't entirely clear. "It's both," Helena said with the patience of someone who had definitely read the entire briefing. "Physical contact is how they form social bonds, political alliances, even their understanding of fate. To touch someone is to acknowledge the possibility of shared destiny. Proximity to their royalty is considered one of the highest privileges." "Fantastic," Adrian said, feeling his anxiety spike in that familiar way that made his palms sweat and his mouth say things he immediately regretted. "I'm terrible with touching. I once shook hands with the Dean of Xenological Studies and accidentally told him his grip reminded me of a dead fish. I didn't get tenure." "That's probably not why you didn't get tenure." "It definitely contributed." The ship shuddered slightly as it began its final approach, and Adrian watched the planet fill the viewport. Etherian's surface was a tapestry of crystalline structures that caught and refracted light in ways that seemed to defy simple physics. Cities sprawled like frozen rivers, and Adrian could make out what appeared to be massive organic structures, towers that swayed despite no visible wind, bridges that looked grown rather than built. "They're beautiful," he whispered, momentarily forgetting his anxiety. "The cities or the people?" "I haven't met the people yet. I'm trying to maintain hope that I won't immediately offend them." Helena finally allowed herself a small smile. "The Etheri have been in contact with 17 different species across 4 galaxies. They're known for their diplomacy, their patience, and their sophisticated understanding of cultural differences. You'd have to work very hard to offend them." "You don't know me very well," Adrian said. "I once accidentally insulted an entire colony ship by mispronouncing their word for hello in a way that apparently suggested their ancestors were romantically involved with livestock. They're still not returning my calls." The ship's intercom crackled to life, announcing their imminent landing. Adrian felt his stomach perform an acrobatic routine that would have impressed circus performers across known space. In approximately 30 minutes, he would be standing before an alien civilization, expected to serve as a bridge between their language and humanity's, expected to understand nuances and contexts that he barely managed in his native tongue. "What if I messed this up?" he asked quietly. Helena turned to face him fully, and for the first time since they'd left Earth orbit, she looked almost sympathetic. "Then you'll be in good company. Humanity has been messing things up since we first looked at the stars and decided they needed names. The difference is that now we're messing things up in person. That's surprisingly not comforting." It wasn't meant to be comforting. It was meant to be realistic. The ship descended through layers of atmosphere that shimmered with colors Adrian was fairly certain didn't exist in Earth's visible spectrum. He caught glimpses of flying creatures, or perhaps vehicles, it was impossible to tell, that moved in formations too precise to be natural and too graceful to be mechanical. Everything about Etherian seemed to exist in that unsettling space between the organic and the artificial, the random and the designed. "One more thing," Helena said as they prepared to disembark. "The Queen herself will be present at the greeting ceremony. Queen Silphira Andavin. She's young by their standards, only 3 decades into her reign, but she's the one who initiated first contact with us. She wants humanity in her alliance network." "No pressure then," Adrian muttered. "Just don't mention dead fish." The landing was smooth, which Adrian took as a bad omen. In his experience, when things started well, they ended catastrophically. The airlock opened with a hiss, and he got his first breath of ethery air, crisp, with a faint sweetness he couldn't identify, like someone had mixed spring rain with vanilla and a hint of ozone. The landing platform stretched before them, an expanse of material that looked like polished pearl but felt slightly warm beneath his feet, as if it were alive and welcoming them with body heat. And there, at the far end, were the Etheri themselves. Adrian's breath caught. They were so remarkably human, tall, elegant, moving with a grace that suggested either centuries of evolutionary refinement or really excellent yoga instructors. But then he noticed the ears, elongated and sweeping upward in gentle curves, some adorned with delicate chains or jewels that caught the light. It was such a small difference, but it transformed them into something otherworldly, a reminder that despite all appearances, they were fundamentally alien. Helena began walking forward, and Adrian followed, trying to remember everything he'd learned about Etheri etiquette in the 6 hours he'd actually paid attention to the briefings. Don't stare at the ears. Maintain eye contact but not too much. Bow at precisely 45 degrees. Touch hands when offered but don't squeeze. There were approximately 97 other rules, and Adrian was confident he remembered maybe 12 of them, and half of those were probably wrong. The greeting party approached, and Adrian's anxiety reached new and innovative peaks. This was it. This was where everything would either go smoothly or become an interstellar incident that future historians would study as a cautionary tale about letting linguists do diplomatic work. He really should have read those messages. The Palace of Etherian didn't follow any architectural logic that Adrian's Earth-trained mind could comprehend. Walls curved in directions that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, and the floor beneath his feet hummed with a frequency he felt more than heard, as if the entire structure was breathing in rhythm with something vast and ancient. He'd been walking behind Commander Voss and the rest of the human delegation for what felt like hours, though his chronometer insisted it had only been 12 minutes. Time apparently had its own ideas about how to behave on Etherian. "Stop gawking," Helena whispered without turning around. "You look like a tourist." "I am a tourist," Adrian whispered back. "A very anxious tourist who's beginning to suspect this building is alive and judging me." "The palace is partially organic," said one of the Etheri escorts, a tall woman whose ears bore intricate silver carvings that seemed to move independently. Her name was something Adrian had immediately forgotten in his panic, involving syllables his tongue wasn't entirely sure how to produce. "It responds to emotional resonance. Right now, it finds you amusing." "Great," Adrian muttered. "Even the architecture is laughing at me." They entered a chamber so vast that Adrian's sense of scale temporarily malfunctioned. The ceiling disappeared into a luminescence that could have been artificial light or captured starlight or something else entirely. The walls weren't walls so much as living crystal formations that pulsed with soft colors, blues bleeding into purples bleeding into shades that Adrian was increasingly certain didn't exist on Earth's electromagnetic spectrum. His eyes were going to file a formal complaint when he got home. The Ethery court was already assembled, arranged in concentric circles that Adrian gradually realized weren't random but formed some kind of complex social hierarchy he had no hope of understanding. They wore garments that seemed to shift between solid fabric and something more fluid, responding to movement in ways that suggested either incredibly advanced technology or magic, and Adrian was no longer confident there was a meaningful difference. "The touching thing," Adrian whispered urgently to Helena. "Refresh my memory before I accidentally start a war." "They greet through contact," Helena said without moving her lips much, a skill Adrian desperately wished he'd learned. "Palm to palm for equals, fingertips for formal acknowledgement, foreheads for deep respect. You'll be expected to perform Casio with the Queen, brief hand contact while stating your purpose. What if I drop something? What if my hands are sweaty? What if I accidentally grip too hard and she thinks I'm challenging her to arm wrestling? Then we'll all die of embarrassment before the diplomatic incident can escalate. You're not helping." A sound rippled through the chamber, not quite music but not quite anything else Adrian could name. It reminded him of wind chimes mixed with a cello mixed with the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff. The assembled Ethery fell silent in a wave that traveled from the far end of the room toward the entrance where Adrian stood. The silence was so profound he could hear his own heartbeat hammering away like it was trying to escape through his ribcage. Then she entered, and Adrian understood why the silence had weight. Queen Silthera Andavan moved through the chamber like she was part of the palace itself, like the organic walls had decided to take humanoid form and walk among the assembled court. She was tall, though Adrian couldn't have said exactly how tall because his brain was too busy trying to process everything else about her. Her hair fell in waves that caught light and held it, releasing it slowly like water holding moonlight. The chains that adorned her ears. And they were spectacular ears, sweeping upward in elegant arcs that made them seem almost like crowns themselves, created a soft chiming sound that harmonized with her footsteps. But it was her presence that really got Adrian. She radiated something that made every instinct in his body stand at attention and simultaneously consider running away. Not danger exactly, but significance. Like standing next to her meant standing next to a moment that history was actively recording. "I'm going to pass out," Adrian whispered. "You're not going to pass out," Helena whispered back. "You're going to walk forward when I do, bow at 45 degrees, and follow my lead." "What if I bow at 46 degrees? Is that war?" "That feels like it might be war." The Queen reached the center of the chamber and turned to face the human delegation. Her eyes were remarkable, large and luminous, a color somewhere between amber and gold that seemed to shift in the palace's strange light. When her gaze swept across the assembled humans, Adrian felt it like a physical touch, and his anxiety spiked to levels previously unknown to medical science. Helena stepped forward with the kind of confidence that Adrian envied and could never replicate. She approached the Queen and performed Casio with a grace that suggested she'd been practicing, extending her hand palm up while speaking in flawless Ethery. The Queen responded, their palms meeting briefly, and Adrian watched as something that looked almost like light traveled between their hands. He blinked. Maybe it was just the palace's weird luminescence playing tricks on his exhausted eyes. The other senior diplomats followed, each performing the ritual with varying degrees of competence. One of them, Ambassador Kowalski, fumbled slightly and said something that made several Ethery smile in what Adrian desperately hoped was amusement rather than offense. Then it was Adrian's turn, and his legs apparently decided this was a great time to forget how walking worked. He approached the Queen, trying to remember every instruction Helena had given him. 45 degrees, don't stare at the ears, palm contact, state his purpose clearly in Ethery. He'd practiced this. He'd practiced this 17 times in his quarters last night, recording himself to make sure his pronunciation wasn't accidentally declaring war or proposing marriage or whatever linguistic disaster his brain was capable of producing. The Queen extended her hand, palm upward in the traditional gesture. Adrian looked at it, slim fingers, skin that seemed to have its own subtle luminescence, those delicate silver chains at her wrist that created tiny harmonics. He opened his mouth to speak the formal greeting. He prepared to complete the simplest diplomatic gesture in the known universe. And then something happened that Adrian would spend weeks trying to explain to himself. A sensation washed over him, not quite premonition, not quite fear, but something in between, a sudden absolute certainty that if he touched her hand, everything would change in ways he wasn't ready for. It felt like standing at a crossroads and seeing all possible futures simultaneously, none of them clear but all of them significant. His hand stopped 6 inches from hers. He stood there, frozen, watching his own fingers hover in the space between them while his brain screamed conflicting instructions. The chamber fell so silent that Adrian could hear the palace humming beneath his feet, could hear his own pulse in his ears, could hear what might have been his diplomatic career dying a quiet death. Adrian started, then his mouth made an executive decision without consulting his brain. I apologize, Your Majesty. Human custom. We have this thing about personal space. Cultural difference. Very important to us. The space. Very spacious. He bowed instead, deeper than 45 degrees, probably closer to 70, maybe approaching 90, possibly just folding himself in half to avoid eye contact. His hands clasped firmly behind his back, as far from the Queen's extended palm as he could manage without actually leaving the planet. When he straightened, the Queen's expression was unreadable. Not angry, which Adrian had expected. Not offended, which he'd feared. Just curious. She tilted her head slightly, and the chains on her ears created a soft cascade of sound that made Adrian think of questions being asked in a language beyond words. Interesting, she said in perfect English that shocked Adrian more than anything else that had happened. You are the first visitor in 300 years to refuse Cashiel. I'm a pioneer, Adrian said weakly. Breaking new ground in diplomatic awkwardness. Several ethery courtiers exchanged glances. Adrian couldn't read their expressions, couldn't tell if they were scandalized or intrigued or plotting his immediate deportation. The Queen continued to study him with those impossible eyes, and Adrian had the uncomfortable sensation of being seen in a way that went beyond simple observation. We will speak again, the Queen said finally, and Adrian wasn't sure if that was a promise or a threat. Adrian spent the next 3 days convinced he was going to be quietly deported in the middle of the night, possibly ejected from the palace via some elegant ethery technology that would make his removal look like a natural phenomenon. Instead, he found himself attending an endless series of diplomatic meetings where everyone pretended his spectacular failure at basic greeting protocol hadn't happened, which somehow made it worse. The ethery were too polite to mention it, and his human colleagues were too horrified. You refuse to touch the Queen, Helena said for the 15th time as they walked through one of the palace's impossible corridors. The Queen, Adrian. Do you understand the symbolic weight of that action? I'm getting a pretty clear picture from your tone, Adrian said, watching the walls pulse with colors that suggested the palace was eavesdropping and finding their conversation entertaining. On a scale of diplomatic incidents, where does this rank? There is no scale. You invented a new category. The corridor opened into one of the palace's many gardens, and Adrian stopped walking because his brain needed a moment to process what his eyes were reporting. Plants that shouldn't exist grew in impossible configurations, their leaves catching light and releasing it in slow waves. Some of the flowers turned to track his movement, and one particularly ambitious vine reached toward him before apparently thinking better of it and retreating. Even the plants are judging me, Adrian muttered. The plants respond to emotional states, Helena said, consulting her tablet. They're probably just curious. Everything on this planet seems curious about you lately. That was true, and it was making Adrian progressively more uncomfortable. He'd noticed ethery courtiers watching him during the meetings, their expressions thoughtful in ways he couldn't interpret. Yesterday, 3 different scholars had approached him to ask questions about human concepts of fate and choice, questions that felt oddly specific and weighted with significance he couldn't grasp. Maybe they're fascinated by human awkwardness, Adrian suggested. Maybe I'm like their version of a nature documentary. Watch as the anxious xenolinguist fails to perform basic social functions in his natural habitat. Or maybe, Helena started, but she was interrupted by the appearance of an ethery attendant whose ear ornament suggested she held some significant position Adrian was too tired to remember from the briefings. Dr. Moss, the attendant said in English so flawless it made Adrian feel inadequate in his own native language. The Queen requests your presence in the Eastern Gardens. Immediately. Adrian's stomach performed acrobatics that defied several laws of physics. The Queen wants to see me. Specifically me. Are you sure there isn't another Dr. Moss who didn't commit cultural blasphemy? She was quite specific, the attendant said with what might have been amusement. Please follow me. Helena gave him a look that combined sympathy with stern warning. Try not to refuse any more royal gestures. We're running out of ways to explain your behavior as charming human eccentricity. The Eastern Gardens turned out to be less of a garden and more of a controlled wilderness that had achieved sentience and decided to become art. Bioluminescent plants created pathways of light that shifted as Adrian walked, always leading him deeper into the space. The air itself seemed alive, carrying scents that reminded him of earth forests he'd never visited and alien landscapes he'd only seen in dreams. The Queen stood near a structure that might have been a fountain or a sculpture or a piece of living architecture having an existential crisis. Water flowed upward in defiance of gravity, creating spirals and patterns that hurt Adrian's eyes if he looked too long. She wore simpler garments than during the ceremony, though simple was relative when the fabric appeared to be woven from captured starlight. Her ear chains were fewer but more intricate, creating harmonics with the fountain's impossible water. Dr. Moss, she said without turning. Thank you for joining me. Did I have a choice? Adrian asked, then immediately regretted his inability to think before speaking. I mean, yes, of course, honored to be here, thank you for the invitation. She turned and smiled, and Adrian discovered that ethery smiles were dangerous weapons that should require licensing. You always have a choice. That's what makes you interesting. Most people find me interesting in the way one finds a transportation accident interesting. Horrifying but difficult to look away from. Walk with me, she said, and started along one of the light pathways before Adrian could formulate a response that wouldn't embarrass his entire species. He followed, acutely aware of the space between them. She maintained a distance of exactly 3 feet, close enough for conversation but far enough that accidental contact was impossible. He wondered if that was deliberate, if she was accommodating what she thought were his human sensibilities, or if she was protecting herself from whatever bizarre instinct had made him refuse her touch. Your colleagues have been very diplomatic about your behavior during the greeting ceremony, she said conversationally, as if discussing whether rather than Adrian's greatest shame. They've provided 17 different explanations for why you refused Cashiel, each more creative than the last. My favorite was that humans require a 3-day acclimation period before engaging in ritual touch. That's actually not entirely untrue, Adrian said, grasping for any explanation that didn't involve admitting he had no idea why he'd done it. We're very particular about our personal space. It's practically a religion. We have holidays dedicated to standing at least 2 feet away from each other. You're lying, she said pleasantly. But you're doing it in an entertaining way, so I'll allow it. They walked in silence for a moment, and Adrian tried not to focus on how the plant seemed to lean toward the Queen as she passed, how the very air appeared to brighten in her presence. Everything on this planet responded to her in ways both subtle and profound, and Adrian felt like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. May I ask you a question? The Queen said finally. You're the Queen. I'm pretty sure you can ask me anything up to and including my social security number. What is a social security number? A human way of reducing our existence to a series of digits. It's very efficient and mildly depressing. She laughed, and the sound made the fountain water spiral in new patterns. I like you, Dr. Moss. You're refreshingly honest in your dishonesty. That's the kindest way anyone's ever called me a terrible liar. They reached a clearing where the bioluminescent plants grew in a perfect circle, creating a space that felt separate from the rest of the garden, almost sacred. The queen stopped and turned to face him fully, and Adrian felt the weight of her attention like gravity increasing. "My question is this," she said, and her voice carried a seriousness that made Adrian's anxiety spike to new heights. "Do humans have myths about destiny? Not destiny as a series of choices, but destiny as an external force, something that reaches for you whether you're ready or not?" Adrian blinked. Of all the questions he'd expected, this wasn't one of them. "We have fortune cookies," he said, then realized how stupid that sounded. "And horoscopes. Some people believe in fate, others don't. Mostly we argue about free will versus determinism at dinner parties and never reach any conclusions. But personally," she pressed, "do you believe that some moments, some meetings, are significant beyond random chance?" Adrian thought about that moment 3 days ago, his hand frozen in space, the absolute certainty that had flooded through him. He thought about all the accidents and errors that had brought him here, to this planet, to this garden, to this conversation with an alien queen who seemed to see through all his deflections. "I believe," he said slowly, "that sometimes we sense things we don't understand. And sometimes those things terrify us more than they should." The queen studied him for a long moment, and Adrian had the uncomfortable sensation that she'd just learned something important, though he had no idea what. The plants around them pulsed with brighter light, and Adrian wondered if that was a good sign or if he'd just failed another test he didn't know he was taking. "In our culture," she said softly, "to refuse contact with the queen is almost unheard of. It happens perhaps once every few centuries. Those who do it are either cowards or prophets, and the difference is not always clear at first." "I'm definitely a coward," Adrian offered. "Let's go with that interpretation. Much simpler." "But cowards don't usually volunteer for first contact missions," she said. "And they don't stand in gardens with alien queens answering questions about destiny when they could make excuses and leave. Maybe I'm a very confused coward." She smiled again, but this time it carried sadness that Adrian didn't understand. "There's a question we ask in Ethery when someone refuses touch. It's old, from our earliest texts. We ask, do you pull away because you fear what you'll become, or because you already know?" Adrian felt something shift in his chest, recognition of a question that had been waiting for him all along. What if the answer is both? "Then," the queen said quietly, "you're more Ethery than you realize." She turned and began walking back toward the palace, leaving Adrian standing in the circle of bioluminescent plants, trying to understand what had just happened and why his hands were shaking. Behind him, the impossible fountain continued its gravity-defying dance, and Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just had a conversation about something much larger than he comprehended. The plants pulsed with sympathetic light, and Adrian decided that even if the palace was judging him, at least it seemed to be rooting for him too. Adrian discovered that when you spectacularly fail at alien diplomacy and then have a cryptic conversation with said alien's queen about destiny, the universe responds by making everything significantly more complicated. The trade negotiations that were supposed to be the mission's primary focus had somehow stalled over mineral rights to a moon neither species particularly cared about, and Adrian suspected it was less about economics and more about everyone being distracted by whatever strange dance he and Queen Silthra had started in that garden. "You need to stop spending time with her," Helena said, cornering him in what passed for the delegation's private quarters, a series of rooms that Adrian was 70% certain were gently reading his thoughts and adjusting the ambient temperature based on his anxiety levels. "She keeps requesting my presence," Adrian protested, pulling up his schedule on his tablet. See. Yesterday, consultation on human linguistic patterns. The day before, discussion of comparative mythology. Today, she wants to show me the palace archives. I can't exactly refuse the queen. You refused to touch her hand in front of her entire court. That was different. That was panic. This is just ongoing professional terror. Helena sat down on one of the chairs that had probably cost more than Adrian's entire education and sighed in a way that suggested she was reconsidering every life choice that had led to this moment. The Ethery diplomatic attaché asked me this morning if you and the Queen were engaging in Threnai weaving. Do you know what I said? I said no, because I assumed that was the correct answer. Was that the correct answer, Adrian? I don't even know what Threnai weaving is. Is it like knitting? I'm terrible at knitting. It's the process of deliberately building a destiny bond with another person, Helena said with exaggerated patience. It's what their royalty does before forming political alliances or life partnerships. It involves extensive time together, deep conversations, and eventual physical contact that seals the bond. So I'm going to ask again, are you engaging in Threnai weaving with the Queen? Adrian felt his face heat up in a way that the room's empathic temperature control probably found hilarious. I'm engaging in trying not to embarrass humanity while an alien queen asks me increasingly personal questions about fate and free will. If that's Threnai weaving, nobody sent me the manual. She's interested in you, Helena said flatly. And not in a curious about human culture way. In a way that's making her advisors nervous and the other diplomatic parties very interested in what Earth might be offering that they're not. That's insane. She's a queen. I'm a linguist who got here by accident. We're not even the same species. The Ethery don't think like that. To them, Threnai potential transcends biology. It's about resonance, compatibility of destiny. And apparently, you two resonate. Adrian stood up and started pacing, which the room interpreted as distress and dimmed the lighting to what it probably thought were soothing levels but really just made everything feel like a moody film noir. This is a disaster. I came here to translate pronouns, not to accidentally court an alien monarch. Then maybe you should stop accepting her invitations. She's the Queen. You can't just decline. Adrian stopped mid-sentence because his tablet chimed with a new message. From Silphira. Personal account, not official channels. His stomach did something acrobatic and unpleasant. Helena raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. Adrian read the message, which was short and somehow made everything worse. The archives await. I found something I think you'll want to see. S. I have to go, Adrian said weakly. Of course you do. The palace archives existed in a part of the structure that seemed to have been grown rather than built, organic curves and crystalline formations creating spaces that shifted based on what knowledge they contained. Adrian found Silphira in a chamber where light itself appeared to be a storage medium, information encoded in photons that danced and swirled in patterns too complex for his eyes to fully process. This is where we keep our oldest records, she said by way of greeting, standing beneath a cascade of light that made her seem like she was part of the archive itself. Histories, prophecies, the accumulated wisdom of 3,000 years of Ethery civilization. Also some very embarrassing poetry from our third dynasty, but we don't talk about that. Even ancient alien civilizations had bad poets, Adrian said, grateful for the momentary levity. That's oddly comforting. We had one queen who insisted on composing epic verses about her favorite type of fruit. 17 volumes. They're mercifully encrypted. Adrian laughed, and some of his tension eased. Silphira had been doing that lately, matching his humor, meeting him in those spaces where awkwardness could be diffused with a joke. It made her feel less like an untouchable monarch and more like someone he could almost imagine having a normal conversation with, if normal conversations happened in sentient palaces with knowledge encoded in living light. You said you found something, Adrian prompted. Silphira gestured, and the light around them coalesced into readable patterns. Adrian blinked as his translator implant kicked in, rendering the ancient Ethery script into English in his visual field. This is a text from our founding era. It's called The Doctrine of Silent Threads. Cheerful title. Very ominous. It discusses a specific type of Threnai bond. One that begins not with contact but with its deliberate refusal. She moved closer to the light text, and Adrian found himself stepping nearer as well, drawn by curiosity despite his usual caution about proximity. According to this, some destiny bonds are so significant that initiating them prematurely could damage both parties. The bond must be approached consciously, with both individuals fully aware and willing, or it becomes a tragedy. Adrian felt something cold settle in his chest. You think that's what happened? When I refused Castiel? I think you sensed something that your conscious mind didn't understand. Our people believe in Threnai sensitivity, the ability to perceive destiny bonds before they form. It's rare, but it exists. Usually, it manifests as attraction, as an inexplicable pull toward another person. But sometimes, she turned to face him fully, it manifests as recognition of significance. As knowledge that a choice needs to be made rather than stumbled into. That's terrifying, Adrian said honestly. You're telling me that my complete failure at basic diplomacy was actually some kind of cosmic sensitivity to the fact that touching your hand would have bound us in some metaphysical way? I'm telling you that among my people, what you did is extraordinary. And the question I asked you in the garden, about whether humans fear destiny, I asked because I needed to understand if you pulled away from cowardice or wisdom. Adrian looked at the ancient text floating in light around them, at the words describing bonds that could shape lives and change civilizations. What if I don't know which it was? Then we figure it out together, Silthera said softly. That's what this is, Adrian. What we've been doing these past days. Threnai weaving, but slowly. Consciously. Building toward a moment when contact becomes a choice rather than an accident. And if I choose not to? Adrian asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Then you'll have chosen, and that's its own answer. But I don't think you will. She smiled, and Adrian saw vulnerability there he hadn't noticed before. I don't think either of us can walk away from this now. We've already begun. Adrian's hands were shaking again, that same tremor from the garden. The archive's light swirled around them, encoding this moment into Etheri history, and Adrian realized with startling clarity that he was terrified not of the bond itself but of how much he wanted it. I'm not good at this, he said quietly. At any of this. I'm a translator. I understand dead languages and extinct cultures. I don't understand destiny or cosmic significance or any of the things your civilization takes for granted. Good, Silthera said. Because neither do I, really. I'm a queen who rules alone because every Threnai bond I've been offered felt hollow. Political convenience dressed up as fate. Until a human linguist refused my hand and made me question everything I thought I knew about destiny. They stood there in the archive, surrounded by 3,000 years of wisdom, and Adrian felt the space between them like a physical thing, charged, significant, waiting. Not yet. The thought came unbidden but certain. Not yet, but soon. Tell me more about the bad fruit poetry, Adrian said, and watched relief and something deeper flash across Silthera's face as she understood he wasn't running away, just asking for more time. It was called Ode to the Crystalline Melon, she began, and they spent the next hour laughing at ancient terrible verse, building threads of connection that didn't require touch, weaving a destiny that both of them could finally see. The crisis arrived on Adrian's 16th day on Etherian, which felt cosmically appropriate given that everything in his life tended toward dramatic timing. He was in the middle of composing a message to his former colleague about the fascinating grammatical structures of ancient Etheri when Helena burst into his quarters looking like someone had just told her the universe was being cancelled due to budget cuts. We have a problem, she said, which Adrian had learned was diplomatic speak for catastrophic disaster imminent. Is it bigger than the time I accidentally called Ambassador Kowalski's proposal, linguistically ambitious in front of the entire delegation? Much bigger. The traditionalist faction has called for a formal ceremony. They're demanding that Silthera publicly renounce any Threnai potential with non-Etheri species. If she refuses, they'll withdraw their support for the Human Alliance and probably collapse half her political coalition in the process. Adrian felt his stomach drop into his shoes and possibly through the floor into whatever quantum dimension the palace kept its plumbing. When? Today. In 3 hours. In the grand celestial chamber in front of every major political figure on the planet and representatives from 6 other allied species. That's not ominous at all, Adrian said, already standing up and trying to figure out where he'd left his formal diplomatic jacket, the one that made him look slightly less like a disaster in human form. What happens if she goes through with it? Helena's expression was grim. She severs any possibility of forming a Threnai bond with you or any human. It's not just symbolic, there's an actual ritual component that would make future contact metaphysically impossible. Their version of burning bridges, except the bridges are made of destiny and the burning is permanent. And if she refuses? Political chaos. Possible civil fracture. The end of Earth's best chance at a meaningful alliance with one of the most influential civilizations in this sector. Helena paused. Also, you'd be responsible for destabilizing an entire planetary government, which is really going to complicate your performance review. Adrian laughed, slightly hysterical. At least I'd be memorable. Adrian, this is serious. If Silthera chooses you over her political stability. She won't, Adrian said, surprised by his own certainty. She can't. She's the queen. Her responsibility is to her people, not to some weird cosmic connection with a human translator who can't even perform basic greeting rituals. But even as he said it, he felt something twist in his chest, because over the past 2 weeks he'd learned that Silthera took Threnai bonds more seriously than politics, that she'd spent 3 decades ruling alone rather than accept a hollow destiny. And he'd learned that when she looked at him in the archives, surrounded by ancient light and terrible poetry, she saw something she'd been searching for without knowing it. The grand celestial chamber made the throne room look modest. It was less a room and more a contained piece of cosmic architecture, walls that seemed to open directly onto space, showing the 3 silver moons hanging in perfect triangular formation. The assembled crowd was enormous, hundreds of Etheri, dozens of alien dignitaries, and the human delegation looking collectively like they wanted to be anywhere else in the universe. Adrian found a spot near the back, trying to be inconspicuous, which was difficult when you were apparently the cause of an interplanetary political incident. He watched as the traditionalist faction leaders, distinguished by their elaborate ear chains and expressions of barely contained disapproval, positioned themselves near the central dais where Silthera would make her statement. When the queen entered, the chamber fell into that profound silence Adrian was starting to recognize as respect mixed with anticipation. She wore full ceremonial regalia, making her look even more regal and untouchable than usual. Her ear chains created a symphony of sound that harmonized with something in the chamber's architecture, and Adrian felt the weight of 3,000 years of history settling over the moment. The lead traditionalist, whose name Adrian had finally learned was Counselor Thrain, stepped forward and spoke in formal high Etheri that Adrian's implant translated with unusual precision, probably because the stakes were too high for linguistic ambiguity. Your Majesty, we petition you to reaffirm the sacred boundaries of Threnai. To declare before all assembled that destiny bonds are the exclusive province of Etheri, that to extend such sacred connection to outsiders diminishes its meaning and threatens our cultural foundation. Silthera listened with perfect composure, but Adrian saw the tension in her shoulders, the slight tightening around her eyes. She was being asked to choose between him and her throne, between possibility and stability, and Adrian realized with sudden clarity that he couldn't let her make that choice. He started moving before his brain fully approved the plan, weaving through the crowd with the kind of determination usually reserved for people who had completely abandoned self-preservation. Helena tried to grab his arm as he passed, but he was already committed to whatever spectacular diplomatic failure he was about to perform. "Excuse me," Adrian said loudly, which in the silent chamber carried like a shout. "Sorry." Human interjection. "Very rude, I know, but we're terrible at protocol." Every eye in the chamber turned to him, and Adrian felt his anxiety spike to levels that should probably require medical intervention. But he kept walking until he stood before the dais, before Silthera, whose expression cycled through surprise, concern, and something that might have been hope. "Dr. Moss," Counselor Thrain said with barely concealed irritation. "This is a closed ceremony. Your presence is inappropriate." "My entire existence on this planet has been inappropriate," Adrian said. "I've accidentally offended at least 6 different cultural norms, I still can't pronounce half your names correctly, and I once told your queen that humans celebrate personal space as a religion. I'm basically a walking diplomatic incident. A few scattered laughs rippled through the crowd, mostly from the human delegation who were probably just happy someone else was making a scene for once. But here's the thing, Adrian continued, looking directly at Silphira now. You asked me a question in your garden. You asked if humans fear destiny, if we pull away when fate reaches for us. And I didn't give you a real answer because I didn't understand the question. Adrian, Silphira started, but he held up a hand. I understand it now. You're being asked to renounce Thrani potential with humans because your people think destiny should follow rules, should stay within comfortable boundaries. But destiny doesn't work like that, does it? It reaches across species and cultures and all the arbitrary lines we draw to make ourselves feel safe. He took a breath, aware that he was either about to save everything or destroy it completely. So let me ask you the question back, Your Majesty. Do your people reach for fate, or do they let it reach for them? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're all waiting for destiny to follow your rules instead of following where it leads. The chamber erupted in murmurs, but Silphira's gaze never left Adrian's face. He saw understanding dawn there, saw her posture shift from defensive to something else entirely. You're right, she said, her voice carrying across the chamber with authority that silenced the murmurs instantly. We've been treating Thrani like a treasure to be guarded rather than a gift to be shared. We've made destiny smaller by trying to control it. She stepped down from the dais, moving toward Adrian with deliberate grace. The crowd tensed, and Adrian felt his heart hammering as she stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the silver flecks in her amber eyes. Dr. Adrian Moss, she said formally, you refused my hand once because you sensed the significance of what we might become. I'm asking you now, with full awareness and conscious choice, will you accept the possibility of Thrani? Will you reach for fate, knowing all the complications and impossibilities it brings? Adrian looked at her extended hand, palm upward in the traditional gesture. This time, there was no panic, no inexplicable warning. Just clarity and choice and the absolute certainty that some moments define everything that comes after. Yes, he said simply, and placed his hand against hers. Nothing magical happened. No burst of light, no cosmic revelation, just skin against skin and the warmth of another person's touch. But Adrian felt it anyway, the click of something falling into place, the sense of a door opening onto a future he couldn't quite see but suddenly wanted desperately to explore. The chamber remained silent for exactly 3 seconds before someone started a slow clap that built into something that might have been approval or might have been shock. Counselor Thrain looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant, but several younger Etheri were smiling, and Adrian noticed that even some of the traditionalist faction members seemed more intrigued than offended. Well, Helena said later, finding Adrian in one of the palace gardens where he'd retreated to process everything. You managed to turn a political crisis into a philosophical statement about the nature of destiny. I'm honestly not sure if that's genius or insanity. Can't it be both? Adrian asked, watching bioluminescent plants pulse in rhythms that seemed almost congratulatory. The trade negotiations concluded in under an hour after your little speech. Apparently, watching a human lecture them about following destiny made the Etheri more willing to compromise on mineral rights. So I accidentally solved the actual diplomatic problem by creating a different diplomatic problem. That's one way to put it. Silphira found him as the moons rose, the 3 silver spheres aligning in their triangular pattern above the garden. They sat together on a bench that adjusted its temperature based on their comfort levels, and Adrian marveled at how normal this felt despite being objectively insane. I've been offered a permanent position, Adrian said. Cultural liaison, based here on Etherian. Apparently, someone thinks my unique talent for diplomatic chaos might be useful long-term. Will you accept? Silphira asked, and Adrian heard the real question underneath. I think I already did, he said, when I finally touched your hand. She smiled, and they sat in comfortable silence while the garden bloomed around them and the universe quietly rearranged itself to accommodate one more impossible connection. Adrian had come to Etherian by accident, had stumbled through every protocol, and had somehow ended up exactly where he belonged. Destiny, he decided, had a spectacular sense of irony and possibly a better plan than any of them had imagined.